common. The capitalist ruling class fears deep organizing. Deep organizing gives workers the power to have a direct say in how their workplace is run. Capitalists are terrified of the idea of rank and file workers and community members organizing to retake power and have their voices heard. But today, as the class struggle intensifies, workers have to relearn the skills needed to organize and form deep connections with our class. As we enter into a revolutionary period, the need for deep organizing is more pressing than ever. Now I'd like to introduce our first guest, Dante Strobino, him, international representative for the Southern Subregion for UE, 15-year organizer with North Carolina Public Service Workers Union, UE Local 150, and the Southern Workers Assembly. Dante, can you tell us about how organizers identify a struggle?
Greetings, comrades. Yes, absolutely. Good to see you all. You know, as organizers, like Comrade McCarthy was saying, we have a revolutionary, our eyes on a revolutionary prize, on the conquering of power of the entire working class and oppressed people. But to get there, we have to have building blocks and sometimes issues and demands. Trotsky wrote a lot about transitional demands and demands that actually build the power and the organization of the working class. And so when you're thinking about starting a campaign and trying to engage and draw in folks that aren't active, part of what we're talking about tonight is there might be folks that show up, there might be key leaders that show up at meetings or that show up at protests. But as we all know, by that third or fourth meeting, the room looks smaller, right? So how to think about engaging the masses of folks in a long-term protracted struggle for power. And so identifying this issue, thinking about, what are some of the immediate issues that we can, draw people in around, right? And so a couple of the key principles to think about is that this issue should be widely felt, it should be a common problem, whether it's a worker at a workplace and workers feeling or in the community, that's widely felt, that people can build unity and solidarity with each other around. And it also has to be deeply felt, right? It can't just be an issue that that isn't going to drive someone to spend their personal time, to actually dig in and build what's necessary. So it has to be deeply felt. But it's when you're first starting, it's good to have a demand that's winnable, right? When we were organizing the Rocky Mount Cummins diesel engine plant in Rocky Mount in Eastern North Carolina, right? There was a whole list of issues that workers wanted to see organized around, wages, racism, all kinds of other structural issues. But the first demand we put forward was a paid Martin Luther King Day holiday, right? We gave people a winnable demand, something that they could immediately seize upon, that could help them build their own confidence and the desire to continue to be involved in a protracted struggle for the long haul, right? But we had to do it in a way, when you raise up demands, they have to do it in a way that build leaders and that build power of the organization. And so why it was important for us to demand for a Martin Luther King paid holiday is because now we use that holiday every year in struggle, right? We didn't just put out a demand that, was nice to have one, but it was something that we can actually use as an organizing tool. So it's actually been going on for over 20 years now, that on this day, workers actually have a major celebration in marches. And so we're able to build structurally upon the gains and the things that we have won in the past, to draw on more people and to spread it out. So these are some important principles to identifying an immediate issue that's widely felt, that's deeply felt, that's winnable, and something that builds the capacity and builds the leaders of your organization. I'm also going to talk about, with my last couple of minutes, some stuff about one-on-ones and organizing. As we know, this is a really critical part of drawing people in, is really sitting down with people or pulling someone aside. Because when you're out, mass agitating and getting out flyers, or you're on a bullhorn, that's important agitation that draws people in, right? But when you get the person there, you got to be able to spend time and know how to do a one-on-one, and how to have those conversations. And really, one of the biggest skills of being an organizer is knowing how to listen, looking somebody in the eye, really listening. One of the key principles we say, and some of these trainings, just so you all know, we're going to consider doing, deeper trainings. All these things we're going over now, each of these segments takes us 90 minutes normally, or 2 hours to go over. And so we're going to go over briefly. But, an organizer, we have 2 years, right? I mean, we have, 2 ears and one mouth, right? So we should be listening twice as much. Actually, we say is 80% of the time when you're in an organizing conversation, you should be listening. You should be asking open-ended questions, right? The more you're asking open-ended questions, the more you're letting the person, drive themselves towards a conclusion they need to hear. And you can ask them questions, follow-up questions that help get a deeper sense, but they have to feel like it's their issue. Because if you're talking to somebody, sometimes they're going to initially feel like the issue that you bite off and that you're talking about is an issue that, they might have a different perception of what you're talking about, right? And so it's important that you ask open-ended questions, right? Like when we were talking to workers in our workplace around defund the police, right? We didn't start from saying, hey, we should defund the police, right? That's a yes or no question, right? You start from asking, questions like, what would it look like if the sanitation department had more funding? What could we do with that funding? Where is that funding going to come from? Why is it that the city always prioritizes funding the police? Why do they do this, right? And let them and ask follow-up questions, right? And so asking these open-ended questions are really an important part of an organizing conversation. And when you're doing that, really try to be focused, right? Sometimes you got to be slow. And if they're speaking, don't interrupt, right? Let folks explain, even if you disagree. We got to keep an open mind and practice empathy and listen to where they're coming from. Let folks get off steam. If you're really having an honest conversation with somebody, folks are going to let off a lot of steam, right? And we got to show that we're really there to listen, that we're acknowledging what they're saying, that we're finding common ground. We're not trying to sell anything, right? An organizer is not a salesperson. So we don't have to worry about, that we have something that we have to scam someone into, but that really trying to establish that common ground and help them to understand, the issue, and help them to see how they can move themselves, how it's necessary to move them into action. And so there's a whole training that goes through the 7 steps of a real organizing conversation, how to have a real one-on-one where you're moving somebody through a conversation. First, discovering the issues by asking those open-ended questions, right? Second, agitate, right? React to what they tell you, ask follow-up questions, show them that they have a right to be angry. This damn capitalist system, racist system, we got a right to be pissed off, right? But then you got to lay the blame. You got to show there is a concrete person that is making these decisions, and that person is somebody that we can fight and we can take down and we can conquer, right? So lay the blame, and they can understand who that person is, and then make a plan to win. Help them feel part of the plan, that it's winnable, that the decision maker is somebody that we can move, right? So help lay a plan, and then get a commitment. When you establish a plan, get a specific action that they can take, get a specific commitment that they can make in that moment, whether it's agreeing to talk to 3 other people, or signing a petition, or circulating a petition, or doing something small they can take, but then make sure that they commit. And then you have to inoculate, which someone else is going to talk about later. So I'm not going to go into that. That's a big part of organizing, inoculation. And then make sure you have follow-up, right? And every one-on-one conversation we have with somebody, we're keeping their name on a list. We're keeping track of what are some of the key points? What are some of the things that motivates this person? What are some of the things that they might be willing to do? Giving them, what are some of the tasks? What are the tasks they agreed to do? Because as organizers, 90% of our work is follow-up. And so really having a follow-up plan, letting them know, hey, I'm going to call you next Tuesday and see if you had any luck making progress on that, right? And so don't ever leave a one-on-one without having a specific plan and a commitment and a way to follow up. And then you following up shows them that you're very serious about them following through and carrying out that work. I think these are some of the simple steps and important one-on-ones to get people moving, to feel part of the plan to win, and that they can be engaged and that they are necessary. Every worker is necessary in this class struggle, and they need to feel that they're necessary to take the steps. And that's what these one-on-ones can do. And I'll stop talking there. I think my time is up. I'm not sure, but thanks, comrades.
Thank you, Dante. That was great. For those of you watching on Zoom, please keep your questions coming. You can just click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to type in your questions, and our speakers will be answering them at around 9 p.m. Eastern time. If you're interested in getting involved in the struggle and joining a revolutionary socialist party, you can join Workers' World Party at workersworld-party.org/join. Now we'll be speaking with Ed Childs, he, him. Ed wildcatted on one of his first jobs at First National Stores in 1968. In his 41st year as a cook and chief steward for Unite Here Local 26, the Harvard University dining hall workers won a historic strike in 2016 that resuscitated the strike in the U.S. Ed also worked on negotiating for an incarcerated workers union and organizing community defense for Black families during school desegregation in the 1970s. Then he organized to desegregate Boston schools and add LGBT rights in the 80s and 90s. Most recently, Ed is organizing through a multi-union coalition led by immigrant recipients of temporary protected status, TPS, who Trump is threatening with deportation to win residency now. Ed, can you talk to us about base building?
Yes, thank you, McCarthy. It's a base building is everything. It's as Brother Dante was showing how to get people into a struggle. Now you have to create a base from that struggle. And the base could be, I'm a dining hall worker, so obviously dining hall workers. The base could also, whatever the workplace is. It also could be in a community. Obviously, Black Lives Matter has a constituency. Tenants, either by region or by a large landlord. Public housing. And anything that a goal can make an immediate impact on people, like a contract or a lease. So that's your base. And that is the most important thing in any struggle is to create a base and organize a structure for that base. And the thing about a structure, this is a problem in the United States, is that, as McCarthy was saying, that in the 50s, this was taken away from us, what we call deep organizing. When we organize a base, we want 100% participation, 100% communication to all people within that base, whether that base is 700 workers or 10,000 workers. So the structure, how is it done? Well, one, it's done as the most important thing that is done is the question of one-on-ones. And in the one-on-ones, you're going to find from the workers that who is the leaders? Who is the leader of a section if there's public housing? Who's the leader of each of those buildings? And who's going to tell you that? Well, the people in those buildings. That's who's going to tell you. And how's that going to be done? By one-on-ones. We have it in the dining halls. Who's the leader of dishwashers? Well, you go talk to the dishwashers. Who's the leader of the cooks? You talk to the cooks. Who's the Haitian workers leaders? You go talk to the Haitian workers. They will tell you. And they will tell you who they are following. And how do you know who is a leader? Because people follow them. It's not the most politically advanced person. It is the one that people follow. That makes the job difficult because you are now, as some people like to say, preaching to the choir. Sometimes these people, they don't follow what you're doing. They're not into doing a strike. They're not into doing something. You're going to have to do what Dante said, to do a one-on-one with these leaders. And it's going to take some time because they're the ones who have to come into it, because the people are going to follow them. And it's doable, because these goals are goals that every worker is going to want. So out of your structure, you're going to make sure that everybody is contacted, that leadership is developed through them, and decisions are made by this base through this structure. So the structure we had at Harvard and the structure in the hotels, and a lot of these strikes that are actually taken off, and a lot of these struggles in the community have different structures. I use 1, 2, 3s, and 4s. What are ones? Ones are they're overall leaders from your base, from the community. These are people who have stepped forward, who have followings, and they understand the whole struggle. They also understand the tactics that you discuss with them. So, and they're in the decision-making process. Then you have 2s. The 2s are the leaders of the areas. If it's a public housing, 2 would be a leader of one of the buildings. In our dining halls, it was a leader of a dining hall. These are the most important people, along with the next ones, which is 3s. 3s are leaders of groups. In the dining halls, it was dishwashers, it was cooks, it was women workers, it was Haitian workers, it was Portuguese workers, it was Chinese workers. They all had leaders that went around, and those were the 3s. So between the 2s and the 3s, they really pulled everybody out, and they also made the decisions along with the 1s. And then you had 4s. 4s are activists. A lot of people who they're really into what's going on. They do a lot of work, but they don't have followers. They're 4s. They're going to do the leaflets. They're going to do the videos. They're going to help as much as they possibly can, and you're not going to win without them. But the workers, I don't follow them, and so that's what's going to build your base. And when you do that, absolutely every worker or everybody in your base has been contacted, and everybody has a leader. Usually a 2 deals with their area, a 3 deals with whatever constituency they're in. So everybody has been contacted, usually twice. And also they also understand that they have somebody to question and bring ideas to. So, and this helps generate activity amongst them, because we're looking for 100%. So that's your structure. Now, one thing that also the 1s and 2s and 3s are going to have to deal with is the power analysis. What power, when you're organized, especially 100% of your grouping, what power do you have, and what power does the people you're going up against have? We had a strike at Harvard University. It was 750 workers versus the most powerful university in the world, Harvard University. We felt, because we were 100% organized, that we had a lot of allies, and we built coalitions, which we'll talk about later, that we were actually more powerful than Harvard University. And we struck for 3 weeks, and we won. We actually got more than we were asking for. So that's because we had a base. So this is the thing, is that once you have the base, now you're going to start your fight. So all that work that you did to build that base, now that's your army. That's the army who's ready to take on a goal that they want. Harvard University, we had, our goal was, Harvard was taking away our insurance. We also had other goals, transgender demands. We had wages. We had other things, but our base was 100% ready to fight about these things, and they were organized. The hotels went on strike the next year. They also had the same things. The hotels were going to lay off 1/3 of the workforce. Also the workers had offensive demands, which was a great pay raise, and also a lot of language against sexism and racism, and they had 100% participation that that they were able to win. So why do we need 100%, and why do we need this structure? Because it's not easy to win. At Harvard University, I'll tell you, by the second week, people run out of food. The second week, we had to go solicit diapers. It's tough. It's tough in the morning. Everybody's hugging each other, crying because it's tough. The hotels went out for 44 days. That's tough. What kept them together was this structure. I want to just go into a few other things about this structure, and it is it's going to produce negotiations. Now you have a structure. Now you're going to have a lot of workers participating in negotiations, or whatever negotiations it is. Negotiation has to be open, whatever way, so that workers can see what's going on and have a participation. Because when it gets tough, that base, if the structure is solid, can withstand the pressures of both time and any retaliation that either the police or anybody else does. This is power. This is the only power that we have, is that base. In this country, we've been doing Pied Piper, like people go in and making speeches and think that that's what's going to get, and they get a little bit from City Hall, or they get a little bit from but that's not what workers deserve. They deserve whatever they can get. And with this structure is the most powerful thing that workers can get. It's what we did in the 30s and 40s. That's why we have the weekends. That's why we have 40-hour weeks. That's why we have public schools that they think they're going to take away now because we don't have this organizing skill. So that's the base. And the rest of this you'll see you cannot do anything. When you're mapping out your struggles, you can't do anything without a base. And so it's a lot of work. But it's beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next guest is Megan Murray, they, them. Megan is a member of Workers' World Party's Philly branch with experience organizing at Whole Foods and Amazon. Megan, how do organizers map out their campaigns and set goals?
Thank you, comrade, and thanks everyone for coming on tonight. So again, my name is Megan. I am with the Philadelphia branch of Workers' World Party, and I'll get a little bit into my experience with organizing at Whole Foods specifically a little bit later in my segment. Right now, I'm just going to dive into discussing campaign mapping. As you should all see on the screen, is a sample campaign map. So what is this? Like, what's the deal with campaign mapping? Why do we do it? Campaign mapping is a pretty straightforward name. It's the process of gathering and organizing information, strategies, and goals related to an organizing campaign. And the kind of questions you want to ask when mapping a campaign include, what are our long-term goals? What are our intermediate goals, as Dante discussed? Are these different? How different are they? Other questions we should be asking are, what do we already have in terms of people, assets, skills? What level of organization do we already have? Based on that, what do we want to build? Who are going to be our organizing targets? What should our tactics be? All of these questions bear on the contents of a campaign map. Campaign mapping can also involve a literal sort of map of one's workplace or community. So in the case of a workplace, where do workers tend to congregate, who's in what department, what areas should organizers avoid due to the presence of management or hostile elements, and so on. Campaign mapping involves really integrating every element of organizing that our panelists are discussing tonight. For example, as Ed was discussing, the efficacy of your campaign map depends on the thoroughness of your base building. Knowing what your campaign has and what it needs necessarily includes identifying existing leaders and supporters, as well as those with the potential to become leaders and supporters. As Ed mentioned, you might already have leaders, but they might not be ready to engage in a campaign and might not necessarily even be thinking of organizing. And having those conversations is absolutely necessary to creating a campaign map in the first place. Furthermore, goals and campaigns must reflect the needs and concerns of a majority, if not all 100% of workers. Therefore, leaders cannot identify goals, or for that matter, organize at all in isolation. It's only through this long-term, sustained, and often quite difficult work of genuine base building and truly deep organizing. Only through that will our campaign maps inform an actually effective route of struggle. In the campaign map diagram that you saw on the screen, you noticed an arrow in the bottom left corner that reads, how will this goal improve people's lives, build their power, and change, sorry, it closed me out of my screen, and change power relations, right? So how is it going to improve our lives, and how will it build power and change the overall power relations? And this is really key, and to reflect on it, I'll sort of discuss my own organizing experience at Whole Foods. So in the case of Whole Foods, where I worked running carts for about 2 years, the existing level of organization was really pretty low when I got there, and for most of my time there. Whole Foods workers lacked union representation, and Whole Foods and its parent company, Amazon, are really infamous for their union busting. Amazon and Whole Foods anti-union tactics range from sort of explicit retaliation to more subtle and deniable forms of inoculation. And my point in mentioning this is to emphasize the gap between long-term and intermediate goals that kind of environment can sort of foster. Unionizing Amazon is sort of like the boss at the end of the game, right? And an honest assessment reveals that quite a bit of struggle does lie between us and that ultimate fight. And although organizers should not underestimate this gap, it is really nothing for us to mourn, because it is precisely in struggling through this gap and by pursuing these intermediate goals that we build power and ultimately build the power necessary to win those long-term goals that right now seem sort of inaccessible or out of our reach. In my case, my Whole Foods coworkers and I identified a struggle around the fact that our boss stole and gifted to the Philly police a significant amount of food and water when the police were stationed at the store during the initial days of a protest in Philly following the lynching of George Floyd. And despite corporate initially denying giving anything to the police and attempting to squash the campaign, for which I was fired for my involvement in the campaign, another form of inoculation, which we will discuss. And despite all of this, workers kept the pressure up. And because of our understanding of what we already have and the assets that we have in the existing level of organization, we knew that this level of organization was relatively low to actually launch a campaign. So we put out a public call to amplify our struggle, which ended up being key and ultimately really caused quite a disruption. And as a result, the boss in question admitted to what he did defeating the police and was put under investigation by the company and will in all likelihood face discipline and will most certainly never work in that store again. And even though, Dante sort of touched on this as well, even though this is a relatively small victory, removing a racist boss from the equation is an important win. And the real significance of this struggle, though, and the significance of this victory lie less in what happens with our boss, because they'll replace that boss with a new boss, I'm sure, who probably is less explicit about their racism. what's of bigger significance is the consciousness raising and empowering effect of this. Amazon's many inoculation tactics have a real chilling effect on the atmosphere, and there's immense power in the knowledge that is forged through these seemingly small victories. We learn this through winning, right? That when we unite and we actually fight, that we can win. And that's somewhat of a genie coming out of the bottle for workers who have not previously engaged in concerted action. So to get into a little bit about why we should be mapping our campaigns, right? Like why do this instead of just sort of having these conversations and letting this develop more organically. So we map campaigns so that we are very, very clear on what we're doing, why we're doing it, who we're doing it with, and so we can organize all of this information in a way that helps sustain and advance our struggle. It's surprisingly easy, for example, to accidentally forget certain workers in your outreach and campaign, whether because they work a night shift and you never see them, or because you're in different departments. All of this can happen, and building relationships in the first place will help prevent this problem. But campaign mapping and base mapping and really getting a thorough understanding of the terrain of your struggle helps ensure that no workers get left out. Campaign mapping also allows organizers to get a clear overall picture of the environment in which they're struggling. And especially at companies like Amazon, who foster and profit from precarity or the gig economy, workers are really often in a position that submerges us in our reality. Through a variety of inoculation techniques, which we will discuss later, the boss will try to confuse you and obscure your understanding of your and your coworker's situation. And campaign mapping is a direct antidote to this. We look at geographical maps to orient ourselves in a broader picture, right, in a broader space, and often to determine the appropriate path according to that orientation. And campaign maps serve the same basic purpose, except with campaign maps, the terrain is constantly shifting. And under capitalism's hyper-individualized and ahistorical ideology, this comprehension of our relation to a constantly changing and developing whole certainly doesn't come automatically. It comes as a result of organizing, and as a result of organizing with the goal of critically intervening in a concrete situation of oppression. The terrain upon which we map does not just shift with chance, right? It does shift with chance in some ways, but we as workers directly shape this terrain through our struggle, whether that struggle is organized or not. And therefore, our maps must constantly change accordingly. So to close, I sort of want to emphasize that, organizing exists where impossible meets possible. And any organizer can tell you that many days, sometimes the majority of days, often, organizing does feel impossible. And there will never be a path to liberation already cleared and ready for us to use. And in order to clear that path and ultimately walk it, we have to map it. So with that, I will turn it over to my other panelists. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you. Thank you, Megan. Our next guest is Sofia Sepulveda, she, her. Sofia is a first-generation Mexican-American trans-Latina healthcare organizer for the Texas Organizing Project. She's a co-founder of the Medicare for All March in San Antonio and co-lead organizer for the Million Women's March in Washington, San Antonio. She is also part of the San Antonio branch of Workers' World Party. She co-founded Trans Power San Antonio. As a supporter for Medicare for All, Sofia has spoken at panels and educational workshops to make sure that people in Texas continue to fight for healthcare by pushing to expand the indigent healthcare program, Medicaid expansion, and Medicaid for All. She was named San Antonio's Progressive Wonder Woman, one of the 25 influential women who definitely run San Antonio, and also made the 2020 active list at the Current. Sofia, can you tell us about coalition building and gathering supporters and allies?
Hi, thank you, McCarthy, for inviting me to the training. And definitely, I kind of have to agree with what we've been hearing, right? It is super important to build the base, but sometimes we understand as organizers the base might not be enough, right? So we have to have the ability to build coalitions, and we have to think of it as a basic skill for those who wish to attain and maintain power and influence. So through coalitions, weaker parties can increase their power. It is the primary mechanism, though, through which disempowered parties can develop their power base and thereby better defend their interests. Coalition may be built around any issue at any scale of society, from neighborhood issue to international conflict. The formation of a coalition can shift the balance of power in a conflict situation and alter the future course of the conflict. Generally, low power groups are much more successful in defending their interests against the dominant group if they work together as coalition. This is certainly more effective than fighting among themselves and or fighting the dominant group alone. Environmental groups in the United States have long understood the power of coalitions. Rather than taking on powerful industries on their own, leading and environmental groups have often formed coalitions to challenge big businesses in the ballot box, at the legislature, and in the courts. They have succeeded in getting environmental candidates elected and strong environmental protection laws passed. Without having many environmental groups working together, industry would have had a much stronger hand in the fight over environmental protection in the United States. We must first identify organizations that share the same values, vision, and goals. And kind of like what Megan was talking about earlier, that comes with the power mapping, right? So we need to do this to demonstrate that our goals are similar and compatible. Working together will enhance both groups' abilities to reach their goals, and that benefits of coalescing will be greater than the cost. Building long-lasting relationships should also be the first thing to do when creating a coalition. Investing time on the organizations you want to court to be part of your group, show up to their events, or support them in other ways, like a simple Facebook share if you cannot make it to any of their events. Organizations see this and therefore understand that you are supportive of their efforts. Personally, I was able to go to every organization meetings and build relationships with either an organizer, an executive director, or even a secretary. That again doesn't mean that you have to do it all. As we were mentioning earlier, Ed said, building a base is part of it. So if you have 50 folks already on your base, you can definitely direct them to go to different organizations and have those conversations and show up for them in support of whatever efforts, again, as long as they match our values. How coalitions help bring together the FDR New Deal, right? It was labor unions, communists, socialists, liberals, religious, ethnic, and racial minorities, Southern whites, and poor people who came together and pushed FDR for the New Deal. The organization was provided by big city machines, which gained access to millions of relief jobs and billions of dollars in spending projects. This group brought Social Security as well as work regulations to many folks in the United States. It would have been stronger if people of color were taken into consideration so that prosperity could have gone to everyone in the country. We can see how nowadays it can be difficult to form coalitions, probably because we're always super busy, right? And now with COVID-19, it can be pretty challenging. But when we're trying to build a support for the first march on healthcare, as well as driving petitions in support of the community, we made sure that we were reaching out to the folks we already knew and work with several organizations like Planned Parenthood Texas Votes, Southwest Workers Union, Domésticas Unidas, National Nurses United, Democratic Socialists of America, and other political parties. We also knew we needed the support of every single one of these organizations in order to achieve the success we were looking for. Sometimes, even though we build a base of amazing supporters and volunteers, at the same time, we also knew we needed to form alliances with several organizations, especially the labor union, right? So, and the AFL-CIO in San Antonio was one of our greatest allies. Many of you might not know, but the union was not supportive of single payer, back in 2016, there was a lot of contention also between rank and file members and the leadership. And the leadership was the one who actually opposed, versus the rank and file members were very supportive of the idea of healthcare for all, or Medicare for all, or single payer, whichever you want to call it. We started to frequent those meetings and crafted a good relationship with the receptionist in the San Antonio office. They will contact us to be part of rallies or social events or political events, and we attended. Folks who started to notice us and became friendly towards us. This was an effort of about 4 months in the making, same with the rest of the other organization. As we began organizing for the March of Single Payer, we talked to the receptionist, which told us that all the unions met once a month at the Labor Union Council in San Antonio. So we asked to be placed on the agenda to speak about the possibility of supporting the march. She agreed, and 2 weeks later, we met with the council. To my surprise, there were a lot of folks we already knew, right? And we've already talked to and had great conversations about the need for single payer. However, there were many more in there who did not know us, and therefore they were very suspicious of our intent. We first, as Megan said also, we identified the issue, healthcare. And we posed a question, right? How long do you spend during contract negotiations to ensure that you keep healthcare, the healthcare you have? Was the first question. Many responded that it takes sometimes days to have an agreement on the healthcare plan that they get, and that even forego increases in other benefits just to keep the healthcare that they have, right? So we asked about the cost of the reality of using their health insurance, which also got a lot of responses on how many times they don't see the doctor because the deductibles were too high. So we identified the reason for this issue, insurance providers, rather than the leadership of the organization or any other folks who they might have gotten upset at for no reason at all. And then we agitated them. And the way that we agitated them was, wouldn't it be great, right? Wouldn't it be great to walk into the negotiating table without having to worry about fighting to keep the healthcare that you already have, and actually talk about races or support or any other benefits that are going to increase the betterment of your union? And people were started to discussing that question, right? And at the end, after like 5 minutes of serious discussion within themselves, we ended up having the support of every labor union in San Antonio, the Amalgamated Transit Union, the AFL-CIO, Unite Here, Iron Workers of America, Teamsters, SEIU. Later after the march, I was contacted by one of the leaders of the AFL-CIO to let me know that they had adopted the single payer resolution at their union convention, using the same question and offering the same vision we utilized, which was super amazing. I can also share you the link at the end so you can actually see it. It was pretty awesome. So another great example of coalition building was the fight for paid sick leave in San Antonio, Texas. We were able to also form amazing coalition with labor unions, community organizers, small businesses, churches, and organizations that came together to demand the city we pass the paid sick leave ordinance. We organized petition drives with the coalition we formed, and we collected 140,000 signatures, which is twice as many as the requirement of the city in only 3 months, which is a huge, huge success. The city had no other option but put the ordinance for a hearing, right? Knowing this was going to happen, we organized a coalition to begin visits with city council. We were able to bring groups of 15 folks or more to every city council meeting in the city. As we were gaining momentum, Dallas surprised us with an ordinance push. Though it didn't pass at first, we were able to reach out with them and have a conversation about lessons learned. The city of Austin had passed a paid sick leave, but Paxton decided to challenge it in the court. So we also had conversation with the leaders in Austin to see what they were doing, what was the ordinance name, what were the issues that was challenged on the court. As the moment for the hearing approached, we were able to pack the council chambers in San Antonio and even get congressmen and previous mayors of the city to speak in favor of the paid sick leave ordinance. And the council ended up approving the ordinance 8 votes versus 2, which is, again, pretty amazing. The fight, we knew it wasn't over. We needed to fight to win the pushback that we knew we were going to get from our state government. And even in Texas, the question wasn't if, but when, right? So we contacted our San Antonio coalition, the Austin and the Dallas folks, and we formed a much bigger coalition, and we mobilized for the Texas legislation so we could go to the representatives and lobby them in favor of the legislation, right? And to stand against, they were trying to pass also a preemption bill, which will deny other cities from passing paid sick leave. So we were trying to get them to fight against with us. At the end, we were able to get 600 folks in demanding the states to not get rid of the ordinance. We got them to stop a preemption bill set to take away paid sick leave protection and prevent other cities from passing the ordinance. We won, right? However, the fight is not yet over. All three paid sick leave ordinances are currently in litigation pending a decision of the Circuit 5 Supreme Court, which we are also going to challenge in any case, right? So building coalitions, it is a long-term process. It does require constant upkeep. Even after you have those coalitions, you have to continue to keep in communications with the folks who are part of those organizations, right? And as organizers, we have to remember always to show up to other folks' events, not only to network with folks who are part of the organization, but as proof that we are in solidarity with their cause, particularly if we agree with the movement. We always want to do it all. We want to make sure our organization gets the credit for the job done. However, sharing the credit with the folks who share the same goal and the same vision of liberation is not only much more fulfilling, but it also shows how you form long-lasting relationships. Let's not reinvent the wheel here. If we see organizations that already have our values and they are fighting for immigrant rights, defunding the police, abolishing ICE, livable wages, we should definitely plug in and ask how we can help. We should also bring our members to show the support and solidarity with the movement. So whenever comes the time for our campaigns to take off, we have not only a network of members for support and a network of volunteers, but we have a network of like-minded organizations, labor unions, churches, willing to fight and stand up next to you in order to achieve your goals.
So well said. Thank you. For those of you, we're getting a lot of good questions. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there's a Q&A button. You can type in your questions. Our last panelist is Martha Gravatt, she, her, from Workers' World Party Cleveland branch. Martha is a longtime Workers' World Party member and a managing editor of Workers' World newspaper. She serves on the executive board of UAW Local 869. Martha's researched the labor struggles of the 1930s and is the author of a pamphlet, In Our Hands is Place to Power, the Flint Sit-Down Strike. Martha, can you explain the concept of inoculating workers?
Yes, inoculation. There's a medical definition, a set of methods of inducing immunity against various infectious diseases. Megan explained how the capitalists inoculate against unionization. So what is it for us in the context of class struggle? What are the potential infections and where and who do they come from? How do we inoculate ourselves and our constituents from these dangers that can impede the struggle? As it is medically, inoculation is basically preparation for the hazards we face. What kinds of preparations are needed to be able to inoculate against defeat and to win against capital? And how has today's labor movement failed in this area? That's a factor in a series of defeats, resulting in givebacks and concessions. Even now, when the wealthy class is richer than ever and can easily afford to meet our demands. There are great examples of class struggle unions, of left-led unions in history who engaged and prepared the rank and file for fierce class battles. We can learn a lot from the 1930s. We can learn a lot from the Flint sit-down strike of 1937, where communist leadership proved decisive. There are some misconceptions about this historic strike, which began December 30th, 1936 and ended February 11th, 1937, when General Motors agreed to do something it swore it would never do, recognize the United Auto Workers Union. The big misconception is that it was a spontaneous event, that there was no preparation. The angry workers just out of the blue stopped work and took over the plants. In fact, UAW Vice President Wyndham Mortimer, also a member of the Communist Party, arrived in Flint, Michigan in June of 1936 and immediately began preparing for a showdown with GM. He managed to get the addresses of GM workers and then mailed them weekly mimeographed letters, which were smuggled into the plants and passed hand to hand down the assembly line. Mortimer made house visits and phone calls, the one-on-ones, slowly signing up and building a nucleus of union supporters. He went out of his way to bring Black and immigrant workers into the organizing drive, holding a secret meeting in a Black church by candlelight in the wee hours of the morning. Regular meetings were held at the UAW headquarters in the Pengelly building, where a number of left parties also had offices. One of the educational leaflets discussed there was titled, "What to Do in Case of a Sit-Down." UAW President Homer Martin, who was hostile to the left, maneuvered to have Mortimer transferred out of Flint, but the replacement was Bob Travis, also a CP member, who had distinguished himself as a skilled organizer at GM in Toledo. On November 13th, 1936, there was what union organizers deemed a, quote, dress rehearsal. Bud Simons, again a CP member, was a union organizer inside the Fisher Body 1 plant. When management tried to cut the number of workers on a particular job, an example of the hated speed up, which was a major motivating force in the union drive, some workers began arguing with the foreman and stopped work for a short time, shutting down the line. The next day, 2 workers came to work to find their time cards pulled. They had been fired, and the foreman tried to fire a 3rd worker involved in the dispute. The workers in the area all stood still, staying inside the plant but refusing to work. Before production resumed, the worker still in the plant was not fired, and the other 2 were located in town and put back on the job. This kind of preparation is inoculation against fear and intimidation. According to law, the workers had the right to organize. But in reality, GM was using the threat of being fired to keep the company union free. Workers could be fired for the slightest offense. Union supporters wore their union buttons inside their shirt collars. To overcome the fear, the workers had to feel their own power, the power to stop production and to win in a short skirmish with the boss. All this was necessary to prepare workers to occupy the plants. Once the occupation began, Travis continued deep organizing of the workers, their families, and the community to build strike support. He had a system of folders, one for spouses who proved instrumental in winning the strike through the Women's Emergency Brigade and the Women's Auxiliary, both led by left-wing women. Another folder for children, one for school teachers, one for bus drivers who were also on strike at the time, and so on. Simons and his comrades inside the Fisher Body plant, Joe Devitt and Walt Moore, were also key. Henry Krause, who was the chief propagandist during the strike, wrote, quote, "They were very good organizers, not only natural organizers. Part of their political training was organizational. You do these things, you have to. Communists are that way, you know? You have to have a committee to do this and a committee to do that. Before you could say the word go, they had everything on the way." This high level of class-conscious organizing helped bring the world's largest corporation then to its knees. This led to a whole slew of union victories after workers sat down in factories, stores, hotels, hospitals, restaurants, and more. Unfortunately, the kind of leadership that led the militant fights in the 1930s was driven out of most unions during the McCarthyite witch hunt. McCarthyism gained steam in 1949 after the victory of the Chinese Revolution struck fear in the hearts of the ruling class. The union-busting Taft-Hartley Act, passed 2 years earlier, had a clause that made it illegal for Communist Party members to hold elected union office. The Congress of Industrialist Organizations, the CIO, that led the struggle in the late 1930s, was now led by Phil Murray, who embraced class collaborationism. All member unions were ordered to adhere to Taft-Hartley's anti-communist stipulation. The 11 left-led unions who refused were expelled. The other unions embarked on a massive purge of CP members as well as members of the Socialist Workers' Party, even though Taft-Hartley didn't apply to them. They also campaigned to have the left unions decertified through NLRB elections and replaced with anti-communist unions. Today, only 2 of the 11 radical unions have survived. The United Electrical Workers, who, as Dante demonstrated, still upholds the model of rank and file driven unionism, and the International Longshore Workers Union, who shut down the ports all along the West Coast on Juneteenth. You can bet it takes a deep style of organizing to get workers to partake in that form of class struggle. The working class is rising. Power to the workers and oppressed. Thank you.
Thank you. So powerful. This webinar is organized by activists and members of Workers' World Party, which is a national revolutionary organization fighting for socialism. If you like what you hear tonight and you want to check us out, go to workers.org and click on the Join Workers' World Party to sign up. You can also read our articles and check out the latest PDF of our paper. Now our panelists will be taking questions, so it'd be great if everybody could turn their camera on. For those watching on Zoom, again, you can click the Q&A button on the bottom of the screen to type in your questions. And our first question is, how can I sign up to participate in organizer training? And before anyone takes that, in terms of, there's been a lot of questions about documents and materials. Definitely add an organizer training, you would get those, but I'll open that up to the panel. So who would like to take this question?
This is Martha. I would like to say that I attended the Southern Workers Assembly School a couple years ago, and they run these schools and they're great because they teach union organizing from an openly anti-capitalist perspective. And that's like something that my union, the UAW, most unions don't offer it. So maybe Dante could tell us if they're gonna have another school, because that's a great training, I thought. I'm not even in the South, but I went down and I got a lot out of it.
Yeah. We've been trying to do a couple a year, since we founded. So yeah, we are going to be having one coming up. We're actually doing a webinar this Sunday featuring transit workers from across the South sharing their lessons around the fight in COVID-19. But yeah, we are going to be doing another workers' school. It's actually going to be, this one's going to be focused on building workers' assemblies and the need to build local workers' assemblies, citywide workers' assemblies. But then we're going to have another kind of more organizing 101 training coming up. But yeah, if comrades or friends are interested, you can email. I'll put the email in the chat to kind of get plugged in with the Southern Workers School, certain Southern Workers Assembly trainings that we do.
Thanks, Dante. Actually, another question for you is, do you have video resources for one-on-one conversations? Someone in the comments was asking about that, or anyone who wants to answer that question, but yeah.
I don't know of any good ones.
Okay, so I'll go on to the next question. This one is for Ed. Given the pandemic, can you talk about how we can do deep organizing online, or whether that's actually possible?
Yeah, well, it has to be done. We're doing it now. It's if you have a base. One thing the hotel workers are doing now is they got everybody's email address, and they do webinars during the week. And so we also have stewards meetings online, and then some deep organizing classes online. So you can start with your base. During this pandemic, one of the biggest problems is that people are allowing their base to drift away. And it's extremely important to keep in touch and also keep developing them. So that's it. It's I did want to bring up a couple points that some people have brought up, and that is while we are developing our base, one thing we're doing is we test people as leaders, and we have little actions. So right now you can do you can organize little actions either online, or now there's actions outside against either employer. There is a huge attack on workers that is coming up, which is tenants and evictions. And this has to start to be organized now. There has to be organized a base. It's a base, as Sophia was saying, it's going to encompass union workers. It's going to encompass community workers. And that has to be started to be done now. And there should be little skirmishes right now. Testing, every little skirmish develops another leader. So that's what should be going on now, to develop these leaders. That's it.
Thanks. The next question I want to know, maybe Sophia might want to answer this one. How does the current Black Lives Matter movement and the ongoing fight for migrant rights, as well as the mobilization for justice for Vanessa, how do we tackle these struggles with deep organizing?
Definitely. I wanted to say also about organizing online, right? As an organization that I work with, Six Organizing Project, we are trying to figure it out, right? And we were having conversations today, and one of the ideas also is if you don't have a base yet, is post those comments, so those information that you have, and whoever likes your comment and is on your city, reach out to them, say, hey, I saw that you liked my comment about unionizing tenants. How about we have a conversation, right? Be proactive. Don't just share stuff online, but if you see people actually liking your stuff or sharing your stuff that talks about organizing, definitely reach out to them, send them a message, right? And ask them, can you bring another person? Do you know somebody who's struggling with rent, right? Bring them together and start having those conversations. At the end of the day, it is you and the folks that you're gonna gather that are gonna be able to make that movement and grow that base from the bottom up. right? Like that's first thing. Second thing, I think when it comes to Black Lives Matter and immigration, we also forget there's a lot of Black folks who are immigrants who are coming to this country, right? And therefore, the fight for immigration is not just for Latinos, Latinx, right? It should encompass everybody who's an immigrant. We have many folks who are coming from Somalia, even from Canada or the UK. So we have an array of different folks who are not necessarily just Latinos, but they're Black and they're white, right? So bring them together. At the end of the day, immigration will affect us all, especially we ourselves are immigrants. When it comes to the fight for Vanessa Guillen, I hate to say a lot of folks keep on going after the Black Lives Matter movement, right? What I have to say about that, Black Lives Matter organizers were the first one who brought Vanessa Guillen's killing to our attention, right? And therefore, we started paying attention to what was happening in Fort Hood, which is not too far from where I live. I'm in San Antonio, right? So with that being said, we should not rely on Black folks to organize Latinos. Why? Because it is not their job. We as Latinos should organize our communities and they will show up. Why? Because they know we show up for the issues. At the end of the day, their issues are our issues. Black folks right now with COVID-19, it is Black and Latino folks who are at the forefront of the pandemic. We've seen the high rates of deaths and mostly on Black and Latino populations. So everything that is affecting us right now, it is affecting the Black and Latino population alike. Going back to school or even having classes online, many Black and Latino folks don't have access to the internet, right? So what are we doing together to make sure that our kids are not missing on education? And we're also providing Wi-Fi to those students, technology to these students who might not have access to those. So it is very important and relevant to understand that our fights are not a silo fight. We all fighting together for the same issues, police brutality, mass incarceration, right? It does affect us equally. So therefore we need to fight together.
Thank you for that. So for those of you who are asking for materials, if you signed up for the webinar and gave your email address, we will email you out some of the stock materials we have about organizing. Next question, I think I want to throw this over to you, Megan. And that would be a lot of folks are going to be that an estimated 20 million tenants actually could be facing mass evictions by the end of September, and that's also tied to the end of unemployment benefits. So what would be some of the first steps for carrying on deep organizing for tenants and unemployed workers who are facing this kind of huge crisis?
Yeah, perhaps I can tie this response into the next question, which refers to the sort of precariat or the precarious proletariat. I think that question is really connected to the question of organizing outside of a workplace. Most of my experience organizing is in my work, but I have worked with my tenants union. It's, I guess, an unofficial. It's sort of a tenants council for the property company from which I rent. And, basically you want to take the steps that we have discussed today and bring them into your community and onto your street and your neighborhood. And, there is a challenge because of COVID-19, right? Is normally you would want to knock on doors. Now you don't necessarily want to knock on doors. So one of the ways that tenant organizers have been working around this, specifically the Philadelphia Tenants Union has been really active in sort of helping with the formation of the New Age Tenants Realty, which is Tenants Association, which is the one I'm in. One of the things that they suggested and that we ended up implementing was sliding flyers under people's doors with some information and an email to contact and a number to call. And people did this for their own building. So people in an apartment building would do one for their whole building. In my case, I have like 2 other people in my unit. And so in that case, it's a matter of getting to know your neighbors. Unfortunately, the person below me is kind of standoffish, but I have a good relationship with the person on the first floor. And this is my experience with organizing at Whole Foods as well, is that the thing that has served me the most in all of these struggles is being friends with people, like just being friends with my coworkers and being friends with my neighbors and having relationships with them that, you know, developed genuinely and not necessarily even in a context of struggle, because that develops trust, right? And so, you know, getting to know your neighbors, developing trust with your neighbors, talking to your neighbors about not calling the police too is like a really important one, and it can lead to discussions about, you know, tenant organizing, and all of these things are related. So yeah, like I said, I don't have as much direct experience with that, but I know that that has been a pretty effective way that tenant organizers in Philly have been sort of, you know, organizing when there's no physical place that people are at. This also goes into sort of this next question of the precariat, the you know, the precarious sections of the proletariat, and I think a question more towards the bottom about like gig workers, which is all tied in. But you know, I think the precariat is increasingly just our class. I think our class is becoming increasingly precarious, and it represents so many deep obstacles to organizing. And I experienced it myself, right? Most of the people who I worked with at Whole Foods were part-time. I was part-time myself, and I had to have 2 jobs in order to survive. Most of the people I worked with were in that position as well. I was working more than full-time, as were most of the people that I knew. The people who worked full-time at Whole Foods basically were dead inside and had no energy to do anything but, you know, reproduce their mere existence when they're not at work. And it's a really disheartening and alienating situation to be in. And when you take away the physical workplace aspect of it, you know, with the Amazon Prime Now shoppers that were brought into the store who are gig workers, are classic examples of gig workers, right? They're hired part-time. None of them are hired for more than part-time. They don't get a schedule even a week in advance. They're picking up shifts days before those shifts, sometimes at weird hours, because it's first come, first serve. So if shifts go up at 3 a.m., oh, I have to wake up at 3 a.m. and get that shift. And these are the conditions that the gig economy and this precariousness is forcing people into. And at that point, you know, this precariousness is fostering one of the saddest, but also most common responses I get when discussing these things and sort of concerns is that, oh, but we're lucky, right? Like across the street, they're making $8 an hour, but here we're making $15 an hour. Forget that we work for Jeff Bezos, who is about to become a trillionaire, right? So many people are without jobs, and so many people, it is precisely this precarious population that makes it so that that worker oppression continues. It's this threat of, oh, well, there's a bunch of people in line to take your job. It's meant to, you know, it's a form of inoculation against that organization, right? It's you know, making you believe that your struggle is individual. It's an extreme obstacle. And I honestly, I don't think I can give a blueprint or a surefire way to effectively, deeply organize under these conditions, because they're really, really difficult conditions. It's really hard to exist like that. And people my age, I'm 23, people my age, people in their 20s and early 30s this is the life we're living. And it's like, it's killing us, like really, and so I think there's a really big question of like, how do you get people involved when they're being crushed by this precariousness, this constant anxiety? It's really hard to like do the work that we're talking about right now, right? And I've experienced this myself. Like I've had, you know, months at a time where I've been beating myself up for being a bad communist just because I was constantly exhausted by working more than full time. And you know, again, like this is an experience. So this is a situation so many people are in. So I think, building friendships and just, commiserating on how hard it is, right? Like the one of the explosive aspects of Whole Foods Market is that they put a bunch of people together who are miserable, who like each other and are friends and talk about being miserable all the time. And that creates pretty ripe conditions for them kind of rebelling at a certain point, which they did. After I was fired, that was not the end. In fact, that was really the spark that set off them. I mean, they were picketing. My former coworkers were picketing like 2 weeks after I was fired. And if you had told me that was going to be the case a week before I was fired, I would have been shocked. And so, even though this retaliation can hurt us, developing these deep friendships with people, and potentially going out of, your comfort zone and reaching out over social media and things like that, developing these relationships with people, I think are really what counts and what can hold us over through this inevitable retaliation and the really effective, really disturbingly effective ways in which they keep us divided and depressed and miserable. So yeah, I kind of maybe addressed 3 questions there, but I don't know if you want to read them. Sorry, I went on for so long.
No, that was great. That was great. Next, I want to go to Martha. And this question is about the COVID pandemic. What can we do to ensure that frontline workers are being compensated with pay and benefits to ensure that everyone's staying healthy during the COVID pandemic?
Well, that's an important question. And really what we're talking about, working class solidarity, workers standing up for workers, is the only way that any of us can be kept safe. We can't rely on the capitalist state. We can't rely on either of the two capitalist parties, the Democrats or the Republicans, because if we could, there would not be so many people dead and so many cases in this country. It's an absolute failure of the capitalist system and of healthcare for profit. A number of comrades have talked about coalition building. I think the unions, the workers in unions and not in unions, we need a massive working class response to this awful assault on our right to life. Essential workers are fighting for their lives, and we all have to. We have to keep in mind the old union saying, "An injury to one is an injury to all." And I'm a retired auto worker, but the death of a nurse or someone in a supermarket or a postal worker is it's an injury to all workers. It's a death to all workers. And I think only by building mass solidarity and demanding safe working conditions across the board are we going to be able to save lives. And I think too, we should be demanding that production of everything that can keep us alive, from PPE to ventilators, masks, gloves, whatever. Let's demand that production should be for need and not for profit. Let's demand that PPE production, if there's a shortage, step up production. If there's not enough test kits, make that. Don't make useless consumer goods that people don't need, because that's where you can make the most profit, selling something that is just a non-essential item. And really, though, the only sure way to guarantee safety on the job and in our lives is by getting rid of capitalism and replacing it with the socialist system, where human needs come first and the profit motive has been eradicated. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah. So I think this will be our last question. The question is, what would panelists recommend as the best first step an organizer can take to begin the process of deep organizing in either their community or their workplace? I might have gotten muted there.
I just had a quick thing that's happening now is as revolutionaries, and my union just took a step that we're 95% unemployed right now. And there's no workplace organizing at the job. But 2 of our members were assaulted by police, dragged out of their houses, and we put out a call to Black Lives Matter and to the union membership. So that's the thing now, is that these things are happening. We can combine these issues. That it's great that Black members, when being assaulted now, can call their union, and the union responds. So we had over 500 people there. And the Workers' World had a contingent there, and we helped build that. The same thing with the tenants. That's going to cross many lines. So it's the unions, the churches, the community groups, the gig workers be evicted, and that these alliances will have to happen. They're not going to happen online. They're going to have to happen in the street. And so, because deep organizing never happens on the line. You can get contacts, you can agitate, but you got to do the one-on-ones. You got to do actual agitation on the street, and you got to start to build. So I just wanted to raise that this is actually going on, and we should be looking into it.
Thanks so much. I hope everyone enjoyed tonight's webinar. Workers' World Party needs your support to continue the revolutionary struggle in this country. We're in the streets every day doing jail support, helping with mutual aid programs, and showing solidarity. We're a totally volunteer organization, and we depend upon donations from people like you for our survival. Everything under capitalism takes money, so any amount that you can donate will help. We will put it all into continuing the struggle to bring down this rotten, racist, and oppressive system. You can donate in 3 ways: on Venmo at Workers World, through our website at workers.org/donate, or on patreon.com/WWP. All donations to patreon.com will go directly to providing free subscriptions of Workers World newspaper to prisoners all over the country. I'd like to thank our amazing panel for a great discussion, and thanks to all of you for watching at home for joining us. Please join us again next Thursday, July 16th, when our topic will be on U.S. threats to China. Good night, comrades.